I'm Cass. Welcome to Sew Focus on Tour. In this episode I'm going to show you how to construct the dress that I cut out previously. I'll also explain some of the terms used in the pattern instructions because we know that they can be quite confusing to a beginner sewer. The shiny side of the interfacing is the side that has the glue on it, and that goes to the wrong side of your fabric. Pop a Teflon sheet over top, and that will prevent the sticky coming off onto your iron. And then just give that a rub over and then fuse that together. Pin your pattern piece back on, and then that way you know what pieces are which. Okay, so I've done that process with my front yoke, my back yoke, and my piece number 7. Choose a thread colour that matches your fabric. So don't look at the colour as a full reel. You need to actually open the thread out and lay the thread on the surface of your fabric and find one that blends with the background. So I'm going to use a pale pink for this fabric. Please be mindful also of the quality of thread that you're purchasing. There's a lot of threads on the market, and it's better to get a better quality thread, firstly because it's actually better for your machine, and secondly you're putting a lot of hours into your sewing, so it's a good idea to use quality products so that you have a product that's going to last. So the thread that I'm using today is called Razant thread. It's a poly cotton blend and works really well with any fabrics. And the other thread that is a good quality one is the Gutermann brand, and there's also another brand called Metler which is quite good too. Try and stay away from your generic types of threads that you purchase from the supermarket, as they're quite woolly and they have a lot of lint on them and they get caught up in your machine. The first part of our instruction says to match our front and back up, so I'm just going to nick my little notch on my pattern, and I'll do the same on my front pattern piece. So we will remove all of the pins on our back skirt. Piece aside, and we need to open out the pattern piece so it's facing up, and then we're going to remove our pins from the front skirt piece. And then open that up and place it so that you have the right sides facing together. Match up the edges of your fabric and then pop some pins in. Now you'll notice that I'm putting the pins in perpendicular to the edge of the fabric, and that's because it's actually easier to stitch when you put your pins in that way, so that as you stitch along your seam you actually have flexibility of your fabric as you're stitching. If you have all your pins going edge to edge, you've got no flexibility there with your fabric because you've got the pins in the way. It also saves you from stabbing yourself as you're stitching. It's also a good idea just to make note of which is the front piece. So I usually just put an F at the top so that I know that that's my front piece. So on the left side of this skirt, we're going to leave the top section unstitched above where the notch was, and on the other side, on the right hand side, we're actually going to stitch that all the way down. So that's going to get stitched from the top all the way down to the bottom. You need to take note of the seam allowance that is used on your pattern, and the pattern pieces will actually tell you what size seam allowance you need to use. The standard seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch. On your machine there's usually a marking that shows you the 5/8 of an inch, and if you prefer, if you have trouble sewing straight, so if you pop a little bit of tape on, you can then use that as a guide for your stitching. I've just used a piece of clear tape here to explain what I mean, but if you use a piece of masking tape, like you can get blue or purple or green, pop that onto your machine and that'll help you keep your fabric straight. So position your fabric so that you've got the edges along the tape, and when you start stitching you're going to do a reverse stitch at the start to secure your stitching, and then sew along, keeping the two edges together and also keeping the edge along the tape. That way you're going to keep your seam allowance at an even distance all the way down to the bottom. And then when you get to the end, you need to do the reverse stitch again. So get to the bottom and then just press the reverse and finish off that seam. Okay, we're going to do the same to the other side, but we are going to leave the section above the notch unstitched, and we're going to stitch from that notch down. So I'll do that and then I'll pop back. Next we're going to overcast the seam. So this is so that the seam doesn't fray. So I'm going to change that foot over and put my overcasting foot on. And this is the overcasting stitch. Right, we're going to open out the seams. So we're going to position the fabric. So I've got the edge of the fabric along the inside edge of the foot. And I'm going to stitch along all of the seams so none of them fray, and it just finishes them off nicely. So the machine I have may be different to your machine, but the majority of sewing machines do actually have this stitch, and if you don't have an overcasting foot for your machine, I would suggest that you get one because it makes it a lot easier to do your overcasting on the edge. Okay, so those seams are all overlocked, so now they need to be pressed open. Okay, before you press your seams open, just press them so that they're flat. And what this does is it actually sets the stitching and embeds it into the fabric. Then open your fabric out and open your seam out flat, and then just run the iron along the center of the seam keeping that nice and flat. Okay, so on the side that has the opening on it, just press that fold and continue that seam. Then turn your fabric over and then press it flat from the other side, making sure that you don't have any ridges in your fabric. If you get in the habit of pressing your seams as you go, you'll get a much nicer finished garment. Next we're going to sew our yoke pieces together. So we're going to have our front yoke, and our back yoke facing right sides together, and then we're going to stitch our left seam. So just changing that back to a straight stitch and changing our foot over to our normal sewing foot. And then we'll do 5/8 of an inch seam, reversing at the start, and just remove that pin and reversing at the end. Okay, now I've marked an F on the front of my yoke here, and the yoke is actually the bodice section of the dress. So this is the top part of the dress. I'm going to top stitch the opening here, so just very closely to the edge we're going to do a row of stitching, and this is going to hold that folded piece back. So it's called top stitching when you're stitching on the top of your fabric. Just turning that around, making sure you don't have any of your fabric caught underneath, and then stitching an even distance up the other side. And you can also use markings on your feet to make sure you're staying the same distance all the way. And I'll just do a second row of stitching along there. And that'll stop that seam from flipping out when it's being worn. Okay, the next step is to gather this fabric so that we can gather it onto our bodice section. To do that, we're going to change the stitch length to the maximum length. So on my machine it's 5mm, on your machine it may only be 4mm, but whatever is the longest stitch on your machine, that will work. So you do a reverse at the start of your gathering, and then stitch all the way along until you get to the seam. And I'm doing this at 5/8 of an inch from the top of the fabric. So basically the seam allowance distance is where I'm doing my first row of the gathering stitch. when you get to the end, just raise your needle and then pull the thread out and leave a tail. So we're going to use that tail to pull our threads up and make our gathers. To get a nice even gather, you want to do a second row of stitching. And the second row of stitching needs to be about 3 to 4 millimeters above the first row of stitching. So this second row of stitching will actually be in the seam of the fabric. So as a guide, I usually position the left side of my foot along the first row of stitching that I've done. So do your reverse stitch at the start, and instead of watching the right hand side of our foot, we're watching the left hand side and making sure that stays in line with the row of stitching. And when we get to the seam, we'll raise that needle and pull out our tail and snip that off. I'm now going to repeat that for the second section. Okay, next we need to gather the skirt to match the yoke. So I've done one side so that I can show you the finished effect, and I'm now going to show you how to do the other side. So we're going to position the edge of our skirt 5/8 of an inch away from the end of our yoke, and the yoke that I am gathering it to is actually the back yoke, so I've already done the front one. And the next point I'm going to pin is the center of the skirt, and I'll match that up with the center of the yoke. Now I still have a fold line pressed in mine, so I can use that as a guide, but if you don't have that fold line in it, you can just fold your fabric in half and then find the center and then match it up. Pop a pin in to hold that in place, and you'll notice that our skirt is much bigger than what the yoke piece is. So now we need to gather that skirt piece up to match the yoke. So from the end where we haven't done the back stitch, we're going to pull up those two threads, and these two threads are actually the bobbin thread, and you just pull them both at the same time and it creates the gathers in the fabric. And as you pull it up, just move them along, and when you get to the pin, just slide it past the pin and it will actually go past into the next section. So sliding it up and then moving it across into the next section. We'll continue doing that until our skirt piece fits into our yoke piece. Okay, so the skirt piece is now almost fitting, so just going to do one more tiny little bit to slide across and then pulling that out so it's flat. Okay, so our skirt section is matching up with the yoke, and I'm just going to keep moving those gathers so that they become even, so they're not all bunched up in one spot, they're actually evenly distributed. So once you're happy with that, just pop some pins in sideways to hold that in place, ready for stitching. And just make sure that all your gathers are sitting downwards into the skirt section and not in the area where you're going to stitch. Okay, so now we've got this section, it's slightly gathered, but we need to pull that up a little bit more so that that fits. And when you're happy that it's the right size, just wrap your end threads around the pin that's in the seam, and then that will stop it from moving as you're pulling your gathers along. Okay, so now you can evenly distribute those gathers. Right, matching up the edge and popping in a couple of pins. And now that's ready to stitch. So when we stitch this, we're going to stitch exactly on that first row of gathering, and we are also going to make sure that none of our gathers get caught up in our stitching, because we don't want it to get caught up and it'll create a funny looking pleat on the right side. Okay, so position your machine needle so that you're starting at the beginning of the skirt fabric, and you need to do a reverse at the start. And remember to change back to your normal stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. And as you're stitching, you can adjust the little gathers if you need to. Right, so just adjusting those gathers and making sure that your fabric doesn't get caught up in the stitching line. You notice that I pull my pins out as I'm stitching. Some people like to stitch over their pins. It's actually better not to, because you can dull your needle quite quickly when you're stitching over your pins. And then just reverse at the end to finish that seam. When you finish, you should have lovely gathers showing on the right side. Next we're going to sew the straps. So I'm going to take the pattern off, and then each piece I'm going to fold in half with the right sides facing together, and then pop some pins in. So the bottom edge we're going to actually leave open, and then the top edge we're going to stitch that closed. Right, so we're going to stitch from the bottom, we'll do a reverse stitch, we'll stitch all the way along the strap, and then when we get to the top we're going to turn the corner and stitch across. So again we are going to do a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So at the start we're going to do our reverse stitch and then stitch all the way to the end. And when you get to 5/8 of an inch from the end of the strap, you're going to leave your needle down in your fabric and lift your foot and pivot on the needle, and then stitch across the end. And then do your reverse stitch just to finish that off. And we're going to turn this through so that we've got the right sides facing outwards. But before we do that, we're just going to trim across the corner so that when we pull it through, it's not going to be too bulky. And I trim that seam back, and then trim the seam down to half the distance all the way along. So I've stitched all 4 of the straps, and now we're going to turn them through to the right side. So I'm using a little gadget here called a loop turner. There's lots of different ways of turning your straps through, but I find this one is the easiest. And I just hook that into the end of the strap and then slide that along. And then unhook it. Sometimes a little bit fiddly to get started, but once you get it flowing, it pulls through really easily. Okay, so now these straps need to be pressed. And before I press the straps, I'm going to sew my underlap as well. So this is my piece number 7, and that's just going to get folded in half, and then I'm going to stitch across each end. So I've stitched across each end of my underlap, and just going to trim the seam back by half and then fold that so that I've got the right side facing out. And a good little trick to get your corners out is just to use a pin just to ease that corner out so that it is nice and flat. Right, so I'll give that a press at the same time as the straps. Before you iron your straps, just make sure that the corners are poked out nicely. So I'm just using a pin to make sure that I get those corners completely out and nice and sharp. And then we'll press the strap. Now a little tip when you're pressing your strap, if you lay it down so that you've got the seam in the center, and just run the iron just carefully just along that seam, so you're not pressing the edges, don't press these edges, just run the tip of the iron along the seam. All the way until you get to the end. And after doing that, then flatten your strap out, and it will actually sit really nice and flat so that you can give it a nice press with the iron, and you're not having to burn your fingers as you roll the edges out. Okay, so just sliding that along. And I've got the first strap done, looking lovely. And I'm going to press the little underlap as well. And I'll press those other straps and then I'll be back. Okay, so my straps are all pressed, and so now we're going to attach them to the dress. So when we marked our notches before we started stitching, that's the position that the straps go. So I'm going to pin the straps into each of those positions. When I pin my straps, I like the edge that has the seam on it facing towards the middle of the dress. Okay, so that's the two back straps, and so now we'll put the front straps on, and it's the open end of the strap that positions matching the edge of the yoke. Okay, and so now we'll stitch them into position. Okay, so the stitching that I'm doing at the moment is only to hold the straps in place until we join the other half of the yoke on, so we don't need to back stitch when we sew these on. We also need to sew our yoke pieces that didn't have the interfacing on. You need to join them together on the left hand side. So when I stitch this, I'm going to do a reverse at the start and a reverse at the end. Okay, so we're now going to match this up with the top edge of the yoke. So just opening out those seams so they're laying flat. Okay, and we're just matching those seams up, and then pop a pin in to hold that in position. Our notches from the straps should match up as well. And our center, that's the center front. And then our side seams will also match up. And then do the same for the back piece. So we're going to match up those side seams, match up the straps, and one in the center. Okay, so now we're going to stitch our lining on, and we're going to fold that seam up from the skirt that has the gathering, fold that up towards the yoke, and we're also going to fold this edge up towards the yoke, and I'll pop a pin in that. So we're going to stitch from here, doing a reverse stitch up to 5/8 of an inch from the top edge, and then we're going to stitch all the way along the top of the yoke until we get to the end where we're going to turn, and then we'll finish up matching with the bottom of the yoke. Okay, so we're going to do that reverse stitch when we first start stitching, and doing our 5/8 of an inch seam, stopping 5/8 of an inch from the edge and turning our fabric, and then doing that 5/8 of an inch seam all the way along the top of our yoke. As I'm stitching, as usual, I'm pulling my pins out as I go, and just stopping at 5/8 of an inch from the end, and then turning along that corner. Oops, oops, and nearly got my pin then. Let me just pull that pin out before we do some serious damage. And then stitching to the end and doing that reverse stitch. I now need to clip across the corner on both ends. And we're going to turn our yoke facing towards the back. And I'm just going to snip the seam here. Just making sure you don't actually snip your stitching, and folding that to the back. So now that the yoke is stitched, what we're going to do is a little professional technique which is called edge stitching. So what we're going to do is just do a row of stitching on the lining edge of our yoke. So we're going to make sure that the seam is facing towards our yoke that hasn't got interfacing, and we're going to stitch very closely along that edge and stitch the seam to the facing. So the facing is the part that doesn't have the interfacing on it. And we won't be able to get right up into that corner, so we're going to start about 3 centimeters in from that edge, and when we get to the end we're going to finish about 3 centimeters away from the end. Okay, so I'm just getting ready to stitch and do the edge stitching, and my needle is positioned so it's about 3 millimeters away from where the seam is. And I've got my foot lined up so that I've got the edge of the seam along the inside edge of the foot. So we're going to do a reverse at the start and just stitching all the way along and just making sure that that seam is facing towards the lining. Right, making sure that none of the dress is getting caught up underneath. Making sure the straps are pointed out this way so the straps aren't getting caught. And as I'm doing it, I'm just pulling that seam out to make sure that it sits flat. And then as I approach the end, I'm going to do that reverse stitch. Okay, so that's very nicely stitched along that edge. Now when we press that, that's actually going to sit down nicely. I've also overlocked the bottom edge here, so that's where I'm going to do the hem. So when I get the iron out in a minute, I'm actually going to iron that up so it's pressed up about 1.5 centimeters. I have also overcast the edge of my under flap. Okay, so now we're going to press the top part of the yoke, and because we've done that edge stitching, it will actually just sit in position so that we can give that a good press, and we'll get a nice sharp edge along the top. Now on the inside we need to cover up where the gathering is. So we're going to do that with the lining. So that needs to be pressed inwards towards the seam. So we're going to fold that up 5/8 of an inch, and then press that flat. So when we stitch this, we are going to stitch it from the front side. Okay, so I'm just going to pop some pins in there, and when we top stitch this, it's going to stitch the inside as well. So put your pins in all the way along. And when I'm doing this is actually the only time I don't put my pins in sideways. I'm actually putting my pins in along the stitch line where I'm going to be stitching. Okay, and then just check on the inside to make sure that all of your lining is caught. And while I'm at the iron, I'm going to also press up my hem. So I'm just going to fold that out 5/8 of an inch. Now if you aren't quite sure about the measurement, then you can actually measure it with a tape measure, but I'm just going to eyeball this. So my hem is completely pressed and that's ready to stitch as well. Okay, so I'm ready to do my top stitching now. So I'm going to position my needle so that I'm stitching about 3 millimeters away from the seam. And I need to do a back stitch at the start, and as I'm stitching I'm going to keep an eye on my straps, making sure I don't get them caught underneath, and I'm also going to keep a check to make sure that my lining's getting caught into the stitching as I go. Right, so you can use your fingers to feel and make sure everything's in its right place. And you also need to make sure that you don't catch the back of the skirt into your stitching. When you get to the end, lift your foot and pivot, and then stitch along that back edge, and then do a back stitch and trim that off. Right, then we're going to go back to the other end again. Okay, just starting at the other end and doing that edge stitch and pivot And now we're going to stitch along the top edge of our yoke. And try and keep an even distance all the way along. I'm actually lining up the edge of my fabric with the middle of the foot where there's actually a notch that you can use as a guide. And nearly at the end, so we're just going to finish off there with a reverse stitch. Need to snip those threads off. Next we need to position our underlap, and the underlap just sits under the under the right hand side, and it's going to overlap about 5/8 of an inch. So we'll pin that into position so that it's got the same amount overlapping all the way down. And then we're going to sew that in position along the top stitching that we've done previously. I'm going to start stitching across the bottom first. I'm doing a reverse stitch and then stitching out to my top stitching that I previously had done. And stitching along that row of stitching until I get up to the top. And then I'm going to pivot and stitch across the top edge, and then pivot and come back down along my first row of top stitching. And then just reversing at the bottom. So what that does is that's actually providing a little overlap. So where we're going to put the button shortly, we'll go at the top, and because there's no zipper or buttons in this section, that little underlap will actually stop it from gaping open. I'm now going to sew the hem. So having that already pressed up so it's all sitting nice and flat, it makes it a lot easier for us to actually stitch. So I'm going to position my fabric so that the edge of the fabric is along the edge of the foot, and I've got my needle in the left hand position. That's going to do a 1/2 inch hem for me. So we do the reverse stitch. Just going to concentrate on keeping the edge of the fabric along the edge of the foot. And we're just going to do a single row of stitching all the way around. So when we get to the end, we're just going to do that reverse stitch again and snip our threads. So the last step we need to do is we just need to do our buttonholes, and the buttonholes are going to go in the front. I'm not going to show you the buttonhole on my machine because my machine is going to be very different to the way your buttonholes are done on your machine. So just mark your position where you want your buttonhole to go, and then stitch your buttonhole, and then you'll sew your button onto the back yoke. I've sewn my buttonholes, and then just very carefully you then need to cut your buttonholes open using a sharp pair of scissors, and then overlap the two openings and then stitch your buttons in position. And here's our completed dress. Thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope that you learnt a lot. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to pop your questions into the comments below. And if you'd like to see more of my videos, please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you. Bye.